Welcome to this podcast on digital responsibility. There's a vibrant community across the world at the moment driving forward corporate digital responsibility, which includes a range of aspects from digital ethics, digital for the environment, sustainability, digital well-being, inclusion, accessibility, and more. This podcast talks to a number of people across that network to gain insight and learning to share across the world. My name is Rob Price, one of the founders of Corporate Digital Responsibility back in 2017. If you'd like to know more, have a look at the website corporatedigitalresponsibility.net. So welcome to the fifth episode of our podcast on corporate digital responsibility, and I'm delighted at the start of 2021 to welcome Neil Milliken, ex-colleague. Amazing achievement of so many things that we've just been talking about, Neil. But would you like to share a bit of your background and your journey over the last few years around inclusion and accessibility?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm head of inclusion globally for Atos Group, which is large digital transformation company, 105 to 10,000 people, depending on what the figures were last time around, in 70 odd countries around the globe, likely to be growing even more strongly in 2021. And I've been working in the space of accessibility and digital inclusion for about 20 years, 10 years within this organization. And I'm still really passionate and excited about the prospects of using tech and business to increase the inclusivity of our world, which is why I'm here. It's why we started talking in the first place all those years ago.
Absolutely, and I mean, when we were talking about digital society and the early days of CDR, of course, we did a similar thing on your own access chat, because they are very firmly linked. This concept that we had of closing the divide, enabling a fairer access to all, greater value for all, strong links between them. How have you seen it evolve in that time?
Well, I think that there has been slow incremental progress over a number of years, which has been accelerating. So particularly around the sustainability elements and the ethical elements in business, there's been a broader recognition of the need to get on top of that as organizations and put structure around that. And Atos has done a really good job around sort of all of that kind of stuff around the environmental sustainability and reporting and transparency. But I think that 2020 was a tipping point for the general public and business in particular's awareness of inclusion topics and accessibility topics, because suddenly everyone was vulnerable, suddenly everyone was working from home, suddenly everybody was isolated and struggling to use new tools. It brought a new understanding of what it meant to use and be included through technology. So as a result of that, the number of projects that have engaged and started to look at and are maturing rapidly around accessibility, digital inclusion, not just within Atos, but in the wider ecosystem of business, have been enormous. And again, you mentioned Access Chat. This is something that I run in my spare time with Deborah Rue and Antonio Santos. That's in its 7th year. We are still going. We've had over 12 billion impressions on social media, and it's kind of a renewed interest in the topic, and new people are coming to us as a result of what's happened over the last sort of 12 months, which has upended people's world.
Absolutely, and one of the things I talked quite a bit about, a lot of us talked about, has been that acceleration of digital and access to services that have been no choice. We've had to do that because of the pandemic, as you say. What about the stickiness of those? Do you see some of those, that continued focus building as we emerge, hopefully, kind of out of the pandemic? Will there be the risk of reversion, or do you think actually we've seen it, we've done it, we've got it now, and it's a launch pad to improving further?
I think that there will be some return to old ways of working for sure, because what we are all missing is that human contact. So there will be some reversion to people going back to the office and having meetings and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there can no longer be any excuse for saying that you can't deliver flexible working, that you can't do stuff remotely, that you can't be productive working from home. Those barriers that were always stated as to why you couldn't do something to include disabled people or older people or people that were maybe needed different things, those arguments are gone, and they won't, you can't put that genie back into the bottle. So I think there is significant long-term change. Had this only lasted 3 months, maybe not. But as we've gone on over a period of time, it's now become something that's really, I think, sustainable. And we're going to have to continue this because we're not out of the woods yet. So I think we will have, permanently changed certain attitudes and behaviours.
And I think that must be true of the delivery of products and services, or using products and services as well, ensuring that, I mean, we had conversations when we were talking about digital society about things like elderly people accessing online banking or supermarket shopping. And of course, I mean, from a personal point of view, that's what I enabled my mum to do over the last 12 months because she had no choice. As an example, one of the things that I'm seeing a lot at the moment is when people are talking about the inclusion aspects of CDR, it is some of the product companies thinking about how they place a stronger focus on wider inclusion, broad accessibility. But I guess my question is, who is it? Whose responsibility is it to think about inclusion and accessibility in businesses at a board level? Who's awake at night thinking how they need to improve?
Anyone that I've got compromising photos of, and they are legion, and we can leave that in. It's fine. So let's leave that one off the cutting room floor. No, in all seriousness, I think that actually this is not just a responsibility of the CSR team or the legal team. Whilst I do report to our chief CSR and digital transformation officer, it's more than that. We report to the board. There is a section in all of our reporting. So Atos do combined reporting. So actually, then it becomes a non-financial measure, which impacts on the financial performance and the value of the organization, at which point it becomes everybody's responsibility within the senior management team to be taking care of this stuff. Plus, they're all humans. They've all got parents. The likelihood is they're slightly older. They may have acquired a disability that they've not told people about yet. They've certainly been struggling with the digital tools that they've been suddenly forced to use because they don't have their assistant seated just outside their office door. So all of these things, I think, have caused people to look much further. But I do think that this sits, absolutely within the C-suite. Absolutely, there needs to be some ownership from all of the executive. And this is one of the things that I like about the Valuable 500, which is an initiative started by a lady called Caroline Casey, which was launched at Davos a couple of years ago to put disability on the board agenda. And it's a CEO-led initiative. So it's the CEOs driving this. They've got their name against it. And you need that kind of top-down communication within the organization as well as the bottom-up. Because, yes, you can always have the grassroots initiatives, but if the leadership isn't demonstrating real buy-in and conviction to this stuff, then the middle of the organization, which is where stuff happens or doesn't happen, will block it.
And I mean, that's good to hear. It's very consistent with the conversations we've had over the last couple of weeks around digital ethics, where again, firmly at the heart of the CEO's responsibility to own and drive that leadership across the organization, but of course dependent on so many other people across that organization to make it real. And in the case that you've talked about there, then clearly operationally from an HR perspective, from a product design point of view, it's going to be the same, isn't it? In terms of you need that there. Do you think? I mean, I guess many organisations are going to be doing the right thing, want to do the right thing. I suppose the question I've got is, but will everybody? And is there a need for further public policy or regulation or compliance, if you like, to drive wholesale and consistent adoption?
Right. So I think there's a fair bit to unpick there. So firstly, there is quite a lot of legislation already, and there is more coming, particularly in Europe. But there have been some real drivers in recent years. So public sector web accessibility legislation came into force. It's been adopted in the UK before we Brexited. And that has had an enormous impact in terms of public sector organizations getting on board and doing this stuff. In the next couple of years, you're going to have the same kind of legislation being applied to private sector companies as well. So you've got the European Accessibility Act coming into play, which requires products and services for citizens in general and from companies large and small to be accessible and inclusive. And I think that aside from the legislative drivers and the compliance drivers, you've got the recognition now that actually your digital users aren't 25, they run across the age ranges. And so the understanding that people need to design for all and and more inclusively and make the products more usable, intuitive, and capture those older user groups is, I think, sinking in. There is a greater willingness, but there is still a lack of infrastructure around compliance and being able to scan and monitor and all of this. There's very little in the way of reporting. So although I mentioned that Atos were really good on our ESG stuff, we're CDP A rated, top of Dow Jones Sustainability Index for all of the things we do. Most of those ratings mention accessibility, mention disability, but don't have any specific KPIs or measures. So having those KPIs and measures is really important. It's one of the things that I want to drive in the industry as a whole. It's one of the things that Valuable is wanting to drive through CEOs engaging on this topic. The other things are, the European Accessibility Act says you must do all of these things, but actually trying to do this and measure it at scale when a lot of the things that you're required to test for accessibility still require manual testing needs resolving. So there's a lot more to do. And then, of course, because this has all come really quickly, or has rather accelerated really quickly, we've been around for a while, there aren't enough people with the skills. So we also have this need to build skills across the organizations, both the specialists, but also into our more generalist education. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've actually led the work on an accessibility specialist apprenticeship standard, which enables organizations to train people up with the skills that they need to have a specialism in it. But we also need to get accessibility embedded into boot camps and coding skills and general sort of technology education from an early age. And so there's all of these various different elements that I think will contribute over time to greater maturity. But there's definitely a lot to be done still.
So it continues to move in the right direction, and I guess what I'm seeing in some of the conversations that we've had through this podcast and through the network, there are many activities across Europe I see around things like benchmarking in digital ethics, for example. So some consistency in measuring that. You've talked about ESG already. Indeed, some of the work in Switzerland is looking at scorecarding for CDR in its entirety across SME organizations and enabling them to kind of get an insight as to how they are faring in all aspects, inclusion and accessibility include. So it would be good to see that continued and helping organizations understand, I guess, what best in class looks like to enable them to begin to follow. As you say, knowledge and awareness in enough people to enable enough organizations to do that might be one of the breaking factors.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true, because if I'm to be a little negative, there has been a lot of people being overly celebratory about some fairly small and insignificant advances, and actually what we need to be doing is thinking at system of systems level for this stuff, and enabling organizations and countries and everything else to look at ways of measuring and ways of assessment, and embedding them into common ways of benchmarking, like you're talking about with these indices. Because again, if I want to tie it back to why management might get engaged, well, again, most people are stakeholders or shareholders in their organizations. When these things start to have a material effect on the value of what they own, that really brings it home to them.
Absolutely.
And so it becomes attaching ownership to the topic. And then the other thing is, actually, if we are to take the analogy of sustainability, one of the things that I've really been talking about for a number of years is actually that failing to do accessibility, accessibility is a thought process, a design process, as much as it's a production and technology process. That is analogous to the production process in general. So inaccessibility is like pollution. It's an externality. So when you start looking at it in these kind of sustainability terms and measurements and everything else, you can attribute values to it, and you can start looking at how you might transfer funding and investments and all the rest of it. So really sort of bringing it into the fold of broader sustainability, so societal sustainability, making sure that people understand that it's already embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, even if it is a little bit hidden, and finding ways to then bring that up the agenda and make it clearer what the contribution is, and how you can tie those kind of finances to it. Because again, if you exclude people, there is a cost to society for doing that, and you're paying for it elsewhere. So if the businesses don't do it, it's society and the taxpayer that picks up the bill. And that's where I think regulation and everything else can play a part. So it's sort of like a sort of continuous circle of improvement.
I think so, and it's that balance between, there will be those who voluntarily adopt and do evolve, but there will always be the need to kind of try and drive that continued improvement of the baseline, get everyone higher, and we saw that. We saw that very much in the conversations that we've had over the past few years around digital society. It's there is this focus on the individual and their well-being and their and inclusion, accessibility, etc., to drive that better society as a whole, rather than otherwise. I guess we're at the start of 2021. It's a tough start for everybody, obviously, because of the pandemic. I'm interested to know maybe a couple of things. One, what's the most exciting thing that you're seeing out there at the moment, maybe that's going to kind of make a difference in the next 6 to 12 months? And maybe another one, which is, what would you really hope to see kind of coming out the pandemic? One wish in this kind of field, but what would you like to share?
So, well, I'm excited about the refocusing on humanity in leadership in general.
Yep.
Much more authentic leadership, much more vulnerability, and there is no longer the sort of veneer of infallibility about leadership, and actually I think that's the most exciting thing of all, because that informs the choices that we then make about the technology that we deliver, the services we provide, etc. Longer term, I mean, I think there's so much going on in the space of machine learning, AI, and so on, that has potential to include, that I'm excited about that. But there is obviously, the whole ethical constraints and how we apply it that we still need to be mindful of. So what I'm seeing is, these things are, rapidly being embedded into day-to-day consumer technology. So that mass adoption of what was niche before is what really excites me, and obviously I can see sort of towards the horizon there's some even more exciting stuff coming down the line that will, particularly around sort of digital assistants and maybe helping make sense of information that at the moment we are all finding overwhelming, that can be particularly useful for people like me that have ADHD, dyslexia, etc., where that overwhelm is just magnified. So those are the things that are exciting me.
Neil, always a pleasure to talk to you. Many thanks. Perhaps kind of whilst listeners might not kind of quite hear this in time to kind of join Access Chat tonight, quick plug for Access Chat over the next few weeks.
Yeah, excellent. So we've got loads of great guests coming up, but this week we've got Tara Moss, who's an author, advocate, and UN Goodwill Ambassador. Next week we've got Andy Imperato, who is one of the leading lights of accessibility and disability rights in the US. Lots more to come. My terrible working memory won't tell me who they are right now. Simon Minty, who is part of Abnormally Funny People and part of the BBC Ouch podcast coming up. So yeah, do join us. It's an open discussion. We're on Twitter, hashtag AXSCHAT or AXSCHAT.com.
Brilliant. Neil, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.